Now that we've talked about South Carolina, or at least I'm going in order of the documents, but so if you're listening to this out of order, then you haven't just looked at South Carolina, but I've just looked at South Carolina. So understand that South Carolina is the first state to secede, followed by, and I don't know off the top of my head the exact order, but that happened. South Carolina secedes in December. I think there may be one other state that secedes in December. The rest of them are all seceding in the first 3 or 4 or 5 months of 1861. Texas secedes relatively quickly, early February. And Texas doesn't quite go to the same effort of making the legal argument, if you will, of saying, hey, the original Articles of Confederation, the original Declaration, the colonial laws superseded the Constitution. Therefore, this makes the Constitution less binding, and that the Constitution, even as it was constructed, was being violated. So that you have South Carolina going to a lot of effort legally to make their case, although slavery is, of course, the big causation for this. Texas is a little different. Texas is going to be different anyways, because remember, Texas doesn't quite have that colonial argument that South Carolina has. South Carolina was one of the original 13 colonies. So this makes it a little bit different for Texas. And of course, Texas goes into making, you can see it right off the bat, referencing the preamble to the Constitution, basically saying that that's why they've joined the Confederate States, that she was received as a commonwealth, and that part of that commonwealth when Texas joined the Union was the existence of slavery. Therefore, trying to limit slavery in Texas would be a violation. And of course, very clearly, the servitude of the African to the white race within the state of Texas, should exist in all future time, is essentially what they're saying. And so that's why Texas is going with the Confederate States. Makes a reference to its longtime connection with kind of the slavery economy, and goes on to say that the majority of the federal government, is now going to try to exclude citizens from the southern states, and force them to have restrictions, right? So they're talking about this idea that essentially the Republican government, and think back to the San Antonio Daily Ledger article that, talking about Abraham Lincoln, that they're very concerned that the Republican government's existing to, through congressional means, take away their state power, to put them, make them vulnerable and that sort of thing. And then they go on to say that the federal government has failed to protect their property. And it talks about, that they've allowed for Indian savages to come in. I think they're making a reference to Oklahoma. Probably actually they're talking about the Comanche. Of course, understand that there's some lack of logic there. First off, the ones that are making the raids, and first off, there probably are not quite as many raids as they're making it sound. The raids are coming from the Comanche, and the Comanche are coming from the Western Territory. Comanches had been around for a long time. That problem is not new. Yes, it's legitimate that they are having issues, but there again, the United States government hasn't had a chance to really deal with the Indian situation because they're struggling to figure out how to create states. And, so Texas is wanting all this reimbursement for things. And from the United States perspective, they're not entirely convinced it's a crisis. Do I think this is a matter of perspective? Is it like when we have a natural disaster and people, we had that tornado a couple years ago, and that was not declared a federal disaster area. So those people didn't have access to federal loans. And I'm sure people disagreed with that decision. So the government sometimes doesn't always back up what people in a state think. So that may or may not be legitimate. I don't know that it matters whether or not, obviously Texas did, but they're using this kind of disagreement with the government as a justification for secession. And it seems to me that they're making a reference to the peaceful Indians in Oklahoma, and confusing the tribes. So there's not a whole lot of specificity, and that's part of the problem here. The raids from Mexico, you just thought, we had in 2017, we argue about crime coming over from Mexico. They're arguing about it in 1861. I don't know how much that was really happening. I'm not really aware, but then again, that Mexico kind of history is not as strong. It's my understanding it's not to the late 1800s, early 1900s you have this problem. But I could, that might have been more of an issue in 1861. And so they're really frustrated for the lack of support there, and that might be a legitimate complaint. But understand that they had also made a reference just prior to this about the incendiaries and outlaws that were coming in, basically trying to make the case that Texas was like bleeding Kansas. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. So lots of effort here to kind of say that that the government was not supporting and protecting their property. And I think this is a relatively weak argument in the sense that the incendiaries that are kind of trying to create slave rebellions and kind of create a bleeding Kansas they're making a reference to John Brown, and that's not happening in Texas. The Mexican, attacks or whatever. I'm not sure that that's happening in significance. There are arguments about Native Americans. While that might be accurate, I don't know that there's enough specificity to really identify where the problem's coming from. And some of this problem might be from Texans that are moving west too fast and are exceeding the reach of the government. So if that's the case, then I think their argument's pretty weak there. Then we start to get to the real part, which has to do with the fact that they are talking about the violation of the fugitive slave law. Now, of course, keep in mind that Texas, for Texas, they don't have to deal so much with the fugitive slave law in the sense that they are so far away. In fact, this is one of the problems with kind of the internal slave trade, which is that slaves knew that if they got taken from the east and moved into the center part of the country, particularly in Louisiana and Texas, it was going to be very difficult for them to escape. That was not going to happen. Well, it would happen, but they wouldn't be escaping to Canada. We'll put it that way. So I think a lot of this fugitive slave criticism is less personal to Texas and more general, building off of things that the South Carolina secession document had. So you can kind of see that reference there. And of course, their biggest complaint has to do with the Republican Party, that the Republican Party has created itself, has this unnatural feeling of hostility to the beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery. So basically that they are violating religious law, and that, hey, this is such a great system. How could they possibly come against it? And that they want to sow the seeds of discord, this abolition. So lots of blaming the other party, which, again, is that legitimate, reason for secession? I'm not so sure. And that the slaveholding states are going to be a hopeless minority. So a lot of idea about balance of power coming into play here. And they talk about they have invaded Southern soil and murdered unoffending citizens. I think what they're talking in part about John Brown. They might also be talking about forts that are in the southern states that have not been abandoned yet, and that kind of thing. The fanatical pulpit, that's definitely a reference to John Brown and a handful of abolitionists, talking about things being mailed into the state. Basically, this idea that they're enriching themselves based on the southern states, kind of making that claim there, and just going on and on about their complaint. But I'm not sure that there's really, you don't see the legal justification in the Texas secession document that you see in the South Carolina one. South Carolina one is definitely a legal argument. This is more of kind of a rant, right? This is more of, yes, you haven't done this, you haven't done that. They disagree with how the government has been treating the state of Texas. But does this actually mean that they should be able to secede? And I think that's the pressing question with the Texas secession document. So you read it for yourself, see what you think. Again, it sounds a whole lot to me like a state that just doesn't like how they've been treated. They don't like the decisions. They sense that their political views are not being represented in the federal government, and therefore they're going to take their toys and go home. Except, of course, they haven't made the logical case about the Constitution and about it being invalid and about them being able to remove themselves from it. So I think that's kind of part of the problem with the Texas secession document. So I'm going to stop here and then talk about Mississippi.